Hello and welcome to our 7th session of Difference and Repetition for the 21st century. Here's Levi.
All right, so today we are discussing Chapter 4, Ideas of Synthesis and Difference. I'm sorry, I was sick all night last night, so I'm a little out of it. Michael is going to lead us off with this daunting chapter, which I can't decide whether it is deeply profound or profoundly a mess. And there's a lot of conflicting stuff going on here. And then I believe next week, John is going to be leading us in the asymmetrical synthesis of the sensible. And so, Michael, just before we jumped into your questions and remarks about this chapter, we had discussed a little bit last time, and I think previous meetings, about this sort of divide within the field of Deleuze scholarship between a sort of idealist reading of Deleuze, which is probably the minority position that would be represented by Joe Hughes, and the sort of materialist reading of Deleuze that would be typified by people like especially Manuel Delanda and John Protevi, perhaps to a lesser degree. And I think we really see in this chapter that there's fertile ground for both interpretations. It was, I think I had been for a long time in the Delandian camp, and it was quite striking to see that he seems to be giving a theory of mind or an account of mind here throughout this chapter. But then suddenly, right, he jumps into things like embryology and the development of organisms that don't fit nicely with that sort of neo-Kantian reading, I guess we could describe it as, of Deleuze's difference and repetition. And I mean, I guess maybe a third position that we could go with would be a panpsychist reading, which would be, the vitalist approach to Deleuze, defending a sort of panpsychism that mind is universal. And we're not talking about the agency of biolife, but even rocks, apparently, as solutions, and stars as solutions to problems, are accompanied with a minimal degree of consciousness.
Yeah, I guess on this reading, I feel like when I get into chapter 4, I feel like it's far more realist and materialist, and maybe that's I approach some of those comments that can be taken the other way with a certain set of assumptions in the background. But yeah, I mean, reading through this chapter again, I feel like he is describing this field, in D&G, it would be the plane of consistency, I guess. He's describing this field through which all actualities emerge. And I think, the fact that he's trying to say that, this same structure of actualization that applies to rocks or to dogs applies to the human mind as well. And if that's the case, then it does lend itself to a kind of problematic reading, because when he's talking about the human mind, we, with the background in philosophy and the history of the role of subjectivity in philosophy, we kind of tend to read those passages like he's saying something unique about us, and this is something related to us. But I tend to look at it as it's just an expansion of what the actualization of rocks or animals or plant life. And so he's showing how once the mind exists through this process of actualization, it's interesting because of our higher faculties, we, in a sense, have this this more expansive way of relating to the virtual. And that's why, I feel like for the first time, I'm kind of starting to understand what he means by learning and this distinction between learning and knowledge. And I really like it because, it's like something as simple as learning to play basketball or riding a bike, where it's invisible to us. We think of it in terms of actualities. My actual body somehow relates to the actual bike or to the actual basketball. But there's all of these virtual elements involved in this. Learning, the appropriate amount of pressure to apply when you're bouncing the ball, or, learning how to keep your balance on the bike. All of this is related to the virtual and the intensive, and yet it's, hidden from us because of representation and the standard way vision has come to be thought of. And so, I really liked this chapter a lot. And I think what he's talking about with ideas, I think they are realist. I think, they exist outside of the human mind, but I think it's, there is an element because of our higher faculties that we have a kind of profound relationship to this, where we can kind of actively pursue testing the virtual, playing with the virtual, experimenting with it in ways that other beings don't. So I kind of, like I said, yeah, I go with more of a realist interpretation, I guess.
And that's the direction I'd like to go in as well. However, speaking of rocks as a solution to problems strikes me as dangerously vitalist. If we give, there are a couple of different ways of taking vitalism, right? One way would be to take vitalism just as any reference to what is living, and so it would be a biological discourse. I think that this is quite common among some of the new materialists. They're using it in that sense, perhaps. I haven't really been able to suss it out, and that's fine by me if you're just talking about living beings. Another way of taking vitalism would, I think, be the more philosophically rigorous approach, that everything that exists is somehow, contains this this vital force within it that can't be measured or experimentally detected in any sort of way. That's not okay to me. I take the strict materialist orientation in that respect, I guess. And then a third way of taking vitalism would be to attribute living or even human qualities to non-human things. And so when we read somebody like the sociologist Tarde as saying that everything has beliefs, everything has desires, even atoms have these sorts of things, that would be that sort of vitalism. And is that just a manner of speaking, right? It's very difficult for us, as Kant taught us in the Third Critique, to avoid attributing intentional language to the universe around us, and it can be a harmless sort of thing. Or is that a serious claim? But certainly, I want a much more materialist and I guess scientifically respectable Deleuze. Maybe I'm conservative in this respect, but I get suspicious of these sorts of things. And then when we're told that a minimal degree of consciousness accompanies everything. That's something that and it's interesting because I think as a reader, you feel like he's, at least a lot of the time, you feel like he's really describing how actual things came into being. It's a theory of morphogenesis, and but at the same time, he doesn't want to go back too far. He doesn't want to do this. So this is how rocks, the inorganic came into being, and then the organic, and then the psychic. And yet at the same time, I feel like that type of scientific knowledge is there in the work. He just doesn't really seem to explore it much. Mm-hmm. And so it does lead the reader to think like, he's working out a new metaphysics that is a metaphysics for contemporary science. And it feels like that much of the time in the book, but then you hit those other places where it kind of throws a monkey wrench in that interpretation. Do we have other remarks or thoughts?
Well, one remark I have on this topic is that it seems to me like he's always taking steps to make the answer of this question a little bit obscure. Like, he's a very articulate writer, and he knows what all these different options are, and he tends to sort of scramble things a little bit. And like I remember in one, I was just looking at the next chapter, and he mentions in there that one of the rules of affirmation is don't explicate yourself too much. That like there's something about maybe part of like the power of his philosophy, or why people are so drawn to it, or sort of keep coming up with these different interpretations, is that there's this this game he's playing a little bit, where he's sort of not coming down on an ism, an idealism or a materialism, and sort of hinting at both, and then forcing thought by doing that. So that his style is demonstrating something about the ethics that he's endorsing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously there's a lot of metaphysical architecture in his work, so it's not like he's just being some kind of poet. But it does, the sense I get is that if he wanted to answer the question about whether he was a materialist or an idealist, he just would have, because he's extremely articulate about so much.
Yeah, and that's entirely possible. So are you suggesting then that this is a rhetorical device on his part, or do you think there's something more going on there besides rhetoric? Not to diminish rhetoric in any way. I guess that did diminish rhetoric.
Well, I think maybe it's partly rhetoric, but I also connect it to his notion of the image of thought, maybe that he thinks that that thought at the end of the day should stay focused on the problems, and that solutions only ever partially solve problems. And so a solution like, well, this is a materialist philosophy, isn't as affirmative as writing philosophy in a way that is closer to the problem. Mm-hmm. Maybe something like that. I mean, I don't like have an interpretation, but I that's the sense that I kind of get.
But then again, to play devil's advocate a little bit, there is a profound mathematical content, throughout this chapter, and he deals heavily, especially throughout the first part of the chapter, with certain certain innovations in mathematical theory, as well as the differential calculus. And so, I would expect that the mathematicians would approach problems in a very serious way. And who is it that he praises? It's was it how do you pronounce his name? The one with the G. I want to embarrass myself with my French pronunciation. Horrible. Galois, I want to say Galois.
Yeah, Galois.
Who developed a way of evaluating the truth or falsity of the problems themselves, and so rather than having to wander about at the empirical level haphazardly to find out whether or not a problem in math was a good problem or not, he apparently developed a technique for evaluating the problems themselves, which open up a great deal of generativity in mathematics.
Sure, yeah. I mean, yeah. One question I have from this chapter is, So what exactly is the relationship between calculus and his notion of problems? And it's like in one section he goes into quite a bit of detail, using these aspects of the differential to articulate these three aspects of what a problem is, but he's constructing. I think he sort of makes a point of saying that it's not like it seems like calculus is on the one hand sort of a metaphor or like an instantiation of this sort of universal theory of what problems are. Mm-hmm. Like he sort of takes these three aspects, sort of the aspect of differentials and sort of says, well, it's like calculus in this way, but it's sort of more open, right? There aren't variables, there are varieties and that kind of thing. And that calculus is just one mode in which problematic fields are instantiated. And there's a mathematical mode, and there's a social mode, and there's a scientific mode, and all that sort of stuff. But then I wonder why it is like what it seems like math sort of has some kind of privilege, nevertheless, because he's using calculus to get there, or could he have taken something from some other discipline and gotten to the same place?
I for one agree with what you're saying here. I think the tendency to overemphasize the mathematics in this chapter, and I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on them, but I think he is using calculus to get at the pure to get at pure difference or the differential. And he gives other examples. There's the physical idea and the biological idea and the social idea, and there's linguistic ideas, and artists somehow relate to artistic ideas. And so all ideas are made up. They're essentially networks or structures of differentials, or what's he also call them? Spatiotemporal dynamisms. He has different ways of articulating this, but there are these virtual fields of pure differences. And what calculus does, I think the main point is that when you do a differential equation and you try to get the instantaneous velocity, right, of an object, there's the x-axis and the y-axis, and essentially, one measures the distance the object's gone, the other measures the time. And so what you get at is this kind of pure difference, spatiotemporal difference, that's relational and doesn't really have any kind of identity in and of itself. And I think that's what he's taken from the calculus. And then he's giving this as an example of saying, yes, you see, this is an example of pure difference. This is how mathematics relates to it. But what I'm doing is I'm building a metaphysics out of this, and so I'm going to encompass the social and the artistic and the biological, all of them, into this theory of the idea comprised of differential relations.
So, I mean, Michael, what do you think the stakes of that would be?
Well, there's that section towards the end of the chapter where he discusses the categories of virtuality, essence, and possibility. I think one of the profound aspects this gives us is that we can account for species or types of beings without having to presuppose, a Platonic form, an essence, a universal, and yet at the same time we're not left with nominalism either. Because the thing about nominalism, it's still locked into the dogmatic image of thought, both realism and nominalism, because what they seek to answer is the question of actualities. Where what Deleuze does is in creating this concept of the idea of these networks of differential relations or processes, you're able to account for why things take on certain traits, certain characteristics, it's because they have this whole process of coming into actuality in common. And that's essentially where the essence in quote lies, is, you know, the essence of each type of thing is really just the differential processes that bring that type of thing into being. And, you know, it gets us at this, the interesting thing is we can account for species, we can account for types of beings, and yet that essence in quotes is itself subject to change. That, you know, there's a whole story about how the ideas themselves emerge into reality, and that, you know, they're not these fixed eternal identities. I mean, there's many species that have gone extinct. Those ideas have themselves gone extinct because there's no way for, you know, them to express themselves in the actual. And so it gives us a metaphysics where, one, we can avoid essentialism in the strictest sense, but two, we're not stuck with just nominalism where everything's just purely an individual, and that we can't really say that similarity or types exist. It's kind of funny how, you know, his account of how things are actually similar and how we preserve similarity is actually rooted in difference.
And so, I mean, you know, maybe a place to begin is, you know, by talking about, well, what is it that calculus does? All right, and so as a branch of mathematics, what is it that makes calculus distinct?
Well,
I mean, I do think that there's really profound philosophical things going on here. If we just, you know, if we think back to, and this is a contentious reading, if we think back to Plato, right? And, you know, we have, what is it? Is it book 6 of the Republic? We have the analogy of the divided line as a way of sort of, and it's always dangerous to say this of Plato, we have this sort of model of reality that he presents us with. And so we have Plato's world bifurcated into the ideal intelligible world, which is true reality, and then the world of appearances, which is the world we see all around us. And then we have, on one side of the divided line, we have being or reality, and on the other side, we have different levels of knowledge. At the lowest level, we have images. I'm sorry for my handwriting. And corresponding to that, imaginings. At the next level, we have things. And corresponding to that, Plato says we can only ever have opinions about the things of the world, and I'll get to that in a second. And then we cross the line. We have math and reasoning. And at the highest level, we have the forms. And direct intuition, this difficult thing to know what it is that he's talking about. And sort of, you know, we can ask, well, what is the founding set of assumptions? And it's dangerous to do this as well with Plato because it didn't exist yet. But what is lurking in the back of his mind with regard to this model of reality and knowledge? There are two principles, right? There's the principle of identity, A equals A, and the principle of non-contradiction. You can't have A and not A. And, you know, so Plato makes him a real philosopher rather than an obscurantist, right? Like maybe somebody like Wittgenstein or somebody, an anti-philosophers, Badiou would call him, is that he's committed to this thesis that that reality is knowable because it has a rational structure. And to say that it has a rational structure is to say that it is governed by these two principles. And you can read almost the entire history of philosophy in terms of struggles with, to maintain these two principles. It's something that comes out in a, quite a striking way with Leibniz, with the sort of tension between his celebration on the one hand of the principle of identity, and on the other hand, the principle of sufficient reason. How is it that we can say of Michael here that he obeys the principle of identity, that Michael equals Michael, when you grow and you change over the course of your life? And not simply that you grow and you change over the course of your life, but in addition to that, you are determined by all sorts of things outside of you, right? If we're to account for, why is Michael like Michael, we're going to have to talk about all the other people in your life, the chemicals that you've encountered, the sunlight, the air pressure, the gravity on the planet Earth. You're not identical to yourself, right? And so what is Leibniz's solution? Leibniz's solution is this crazy monadology, right? Where he says that each monad, each thing that exists, contains everything that will ever happen to it, past, present, and future. It's like a DVD. And so it's all already there. It's a kind of an illusion that we're having this conversation at all. This meeting was already contained within you, and it just has to unfold at the appropriate time, just like when you play that movie or something like that. And then, he has this idea of pre-established harmony. And so it's not that things cause and affect one another. It's that all the DVDs are unfolding in tandem in a way that each one expresses the other from a particular point of view. It is this, this sort of mad philosophy that, is really, as Deleuze says in his lectures, this battle cry on behalf of reason. And, Leibniz's position is the universe has to be this way because God is good. And if God is good, God has to be rational. And if God is rational, then reality has to obey the principles of logic, right? Because it's better to be rational than to be irrational, this profound belief that the big other exists. And, so you see this all throughout the history of philosophy, these struggles with the reality that we encounter versus, these sorts of principles of reason, if we're not talking about an anti-philosopher. And in the case of, Plato, the form that takes, it takes the form of this renunciation of the world that we live in. It's astonishing when you think it through. Why is it that Plato says we can only ever have opinions about physical objects, about physical reality? It's not because everybody thinks of things differently. It's not because everybody perceives things from a different point of view or that they all interpret things differently. It has nothing to do with that whatsoever. For him, it's built into the very fabric of appearances that because they change, right? And Hegel will make much hay of this later on, because they change, what is true of them now becomes false later. And so I say that the rose is red. Well, that's true right now, but next week, right, as Hegel says at the beginning of the Phenomenology, that truth is going to grow stale. It becomes false. So the world of becoming just inherently can't be true because it's inherently contradictory. It doesn't obey this principle of identity. And so what is so fascinating about the differential calculus, I think, and so there was a lead up here, right? What is so fascinating about the differential calculus is it seems to overcome this sort of problem. If we think about what it is that the calculus is doing, the calculus gives us the calculus, right? Do I sound like a Republican? The internets, right? The calculus is the mathematics of things undergoing perpetual transformation, right? Endless increases in velocity, shades of color, the movement of a curve, or something like that, where no 2 points on that line or no 2 speeds at that moment are the same, right? And I mean, here's the real kicker. Here's the amazing thing about the calculus. It renders things in a constant state of becoming intelligible. right? And so where, throughout much of the history of philosophy, and Deleuze is making a lot of hay about this with representation, with Plato, above all with Kant, who he has a, what I would call a late relationship with, a portmanteau word, a love-hate relationship with. Right, what the problem that you endlessly encounter is this gulf between the conceptual, the category, and individual, the singular, the individual thing. The two never quite fit together, right? And this is what he's going on about with the problem of the schematism in the Critique of Pure Reason. He says the schematism is absolutely necessary in Kant's philosophy because we need some way of understanding how the categories of the understanding, which are purely abstract and formal, can be applied to the individuals of experience. We can't see how that would be done unless there's a mediator between these two things that would surmount the gap between those two things. And we get a similar problem in Plato with the whole theory of participation and where individuals, come from. We can kind of think of the good on the divided line as like a rain cloud that things somehow trickle out of. But the schematism, these spatio-temporal schemata doesn't really solve that problem, because when Kant explains the schemata, what does he say? He says they're conceptual determinations of time and space, but that's exactly the problem. How can we get a conceptual determination of the sensible, of the individual? It's begging the question. This is why he says it can only occur by virtue of a miracle. The calculus doesn't seem to run into this problem at all, because you already have intelligibility, this rational structure, at work in that which is most singular. Somewhere, I believe it's in the Discourse of Metaphysics, what is it that Leibniz says? He says, you could have a piece of paper with a bunch of random points on it, but they wouldn't be random at all. There is an equation that corresponds to how each one of those points was placed, and that would allow you to draw the line connecting all of these things. So this absolute singularity mixed with intelligibility. And so in this regard, Deleuze, he wouldn't be an anti-philosopher. I mean, it's a very, maybe I take him more seriously than I should. But when he talks about a principle of sufficient reason, I think, God damn it, he means sufficient reason, something that would completely account for that singularity.
So I have sort of a question. Why do you think? Well, I'm gonna try to phrase the question. So he uses calculus, but the concepts that he actually creates are based on these sort of devices from calculus, but he sort of goes to great lengths to distinguish them from calculus, like for example, like he draws a distinction between like variability and variety. Like it's like this sort of. Oh wait, I had some notes, but I can't find them. But yeah, I'm curious what you have to say about his take on the relationship between literally calculus and the metaphysics that he's deriving from calculus.
Yeah, and I mean, he's cagey on this, right? I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, go for it.
I mean, he's cagey on this, and I'm not. I do recall that there's a really great article floating around out there by Dan Smith, and it's probably published now in his collection on all of these sorts of issues. That is sort of comparing and contrasting Deleuze and Badiou, calculus versus set theory, and that addresses some of these issues as to what the status is of calculus for him. And so it is unclear as to where he's coming down as to just how literally we're supposed to take the calculus here. But what else was it that you were asking?
That was my. Well, yeah. I said two things, or I said I had two things to say, but I didn't say the second one because that's such a big and kind of interesting question. Like he, he's referring to all these sort of strange, cryptic, seemingly forgotten thinkers like Wronski, these sort of like occultists of the calculus, and then he there's all this like distinguishing quality from qualitability and quantity from quantitability. Like he seems to have some rule for demathematizing these concepts. I don't know.
I'm not sure that he is demathematizing them. And so, like, again, first off, just in some ways, he's more Platonist than Plato, right? And so, there's always the question for me on the divided line: why is mathematics not the highest reality for Plato? Why do we have the forms over and above that? Why is reasoning not the highest? And one of the things that you can notice about the analogy of the divided line is that the second level recapitulates the first, right? And so we have images at the lowest level, and images, it's a whole logic of copying, right? And so images are copies of the things, and the things are copies of the mathematical objects, and the mathematical objects are copies of the forms. And at least before the advent of digital technology, this logic of copying, whenever you make an additional copy, right, whenever the copy is further removed, it is less perfect, right? And so there's this whole model of perfection. But why is it that math isn't the highest for Plato? What is it that Plato says? He says, and it's this whole Derridian theme, he says, math isn't the highest form of knowledge because it relies on diagrams and writing. I mean, it's this, really surprising thesis. You're like, what the hell is the problem with diagrams and writing? But the point is rather profound, right? It's that no matter how, so we're using the mathematical diagram to try and think about triangleness, this form of triangleness. And no matter how hard we try to draw triangleness, we will only end up drawing a triangle. It's either going to be a right triangle or a scalene triangle or isosceles or an equilateral. We can't draw triangleness itself. All right, and what is the danger of these images? The danger of these images, this is Plato's whole polemic against giving of examples that comes up again and again throughout the dialogues. The danger of the images is that even though they help us to think about these things, they can lead us to overlook all sorts of other dimensions of that sort of that form that we're trying to talk about. And so if I take the example of the courtroom as justice, well, that's fine. Yeah, it's true. Justice is something that hopefully takes place in the courtroom, but I'm going to be overlooking, right, people being treated equally, people getting fair pay, people getting a Coke out of the Coke machine when they buy a Coke. All of those things pertain to justice as well. I'll only do the right thing when it comes to persecuting people who have committed crimes, and I will overlook all the rest. This is a sort of point that Plato is making. And so this is exactly the sort of issue that Deleuze, I think, is talking about with respect to essentialism and representation. We have this abstract concept, but what do we do with that concept? We always fill it out with a particular that is supposed to exemplify that sort of thing. That's what inevitably happens with the logic of representation, right? That you have a privileged example of what a dog is, or a privileged example of what a human being is, or a privileged example of what life is. Doesn't matter. And what is it that the differential calculus is able to do? It is able to unify continuity with variability. All of the degrees between 0 degree of that phenomena and however far it can go. I think Deleuze would probably favor the infinity of possibilities. And so if we think about redness from the standpoint of representation, right? When we think in essentialist terms, representationalist terms, somebody is going to treat one particular shade of red as what is truly red, as capturing the essence of what redness is. And then they'll make claims like, yeah, that other shade is not really red. This is the true red. That other shade, yet that other shade, again, not truly red. Whereas the differential equation in reciprocal determination carries all of the variations of that red or color in general as belonging to the essence. It's able to generate them. And so it approaches what Plato might think of as a form.
And so in a way, is it almost like that like the singular point, like the singularity is sort of what he's replacing the form with, right? Like the singular point is sort of what the degrees approach as they approach infinity, and that point is never actually reached, but it has this, it's sort of like what they call an attractor in systems theory.
And I mean, there are all kinds of attractors, and sometimes they are reached. But I'm trying to think how to put this. The singular points, they aren't what are approached. They are what constitute, I think, and maybe I have it all wrong, the genetic features of the multiplicity or the idea or the problem in Deleuze. And so, perhaps we could say that a triangle is composed of 3 singular points, its vertices, but the problem of the triangle, its status as a multiplicity or as an idea, is no particular triangle. It's all of the variations that can take place according to that space. And so, like in my own work, I described it in the past as a topology. It is the difference between Euclidean geometry and typology is that Euclidean geometry has fixed forms or essences, and topology, sometimes described as rubber sheet geometry or dynamic geometry. We're not thinking of fixed forms like scaling, isosceles, equilateral, and everything. We're thinking of a series of possible permutations that you can go through to get from one of these variations to another. And so in topology, for example, as I understand it, and I'm no expert here, maybe John will beat me up, but in topology, as I understand it, a square, a quadrilateral, and a triangle and a circle are all equivalent to one another because there are a series of permutations that you can go through to get from one to the other. Series of transformations through activities of bending and folding.
Levi, that example that D and G have in A Thousand Plateaus comes to mind here, of why the difference they see between classical music and jazz, where, you know, with jazz, you can take a single melody, but since it's based on improvisation, what the jazz musicians essentially do is they test out the virtual elements of that melody, and they're exploring the virtual. They're exploring how many different ways this can be actualized, how many different variations it can have. Whereas, you know, with a classical music, the key is to play it as much in line with the sheet music as you can. Traditionally, jazz is all about exploring this region of virtuality, in the sense that it's all about varying and actualizing some new variation on that melody that hasn't been done before.
Yeah. And I mean, doesn't he somewhere talk about like white language and white light? And he has this unfortunate, that if you think about it in racial terms, it sounds really horrible. But I mean, when he says, you know, the idea of color is white light, you know, what does he mean? Like, you know, white light is supposed to be all of the possible colors. Isn't that right? And so the idea of color, in the sense that he's using the idea of color, is all of the possible variations that can generate something like color. When he talks about white society, he means all of the, you know, the singularities that compose a society at the virtual level that can then generate all of the different possible societies. Well, again, I use that word possible. All of the different societies that can exist. And I use the word can, another possibility word. I mean, it's tough.
I wonder if I could just ask a question about your explanation of calculus, and something kind of relates to what Hunter was saying. On page 71 or 171, he talks about the kind of this esoteric history of differential philosophy and how it can't be sacrificed to modern scientific technique. And that made a lot of sense, because I was having a lot of trouble.
Where does he say this explicitly?
This is, right at the top of 171. He's talking about these three figures of Maimon, Vronsky, and Bordas de Moulin. And I was trying to do some reading on calculus and try and figure out this distinction he's making within interpretations of calculus. But kind of relating back to what Michael was saying at the start of class, if he is trying to give a metaphysical account that's coming to terms with what we think of as modern science, like, why does he have to do this esoteric kind of uncovering of these kind of minor figures in calculus? What you just said about calculus being kind of this intelligible structure to becoming, like, that makes a lot of sense. Why it's his kind of, why he needs to demonstrate it before moving on to kind of the rest of what he does in this chapter. But then what's this modern scientific calculus that is different, or like that so that's kind of what, maybe because I don't understand calculus very well, I don't know, I'm having trouble with that.
Yeah, and I don't understand it very well either. So this has been, you know, what I've been able to piece together.
Yeah.
You know, myself, and there is a story to be told here. And again, I seem to recall, and it's probably been like 15 years since I read the article, that Dan Smith talks about these sorts of issues in the history of mathematics. I know there was an article I came across somewhere, and I want to say it was Dan's. But I'm not entirely sure what that story is. I think the idea is that and I could be completely wrong here, so I hesitate to say anything at all. I think the idea is that the sort of consensus that emerged in the wake of the development of calculus was that these were a series of conventions or fictions, right, that serve a practical purpose in the description of things becoming or in a state of motion. And so what he's trying to do is kind of repeat some of the moments in that debate before that decision was made to see the sort of more interesting metaphysical and philosophical or ontological issues that these mathematicians were engaging with. And I wish I could tell a more interesting story.
Yeah, why I think this is so interesting is just because I feel like this chapter really gives some insight into Deleuze's relationship to science, and I feel like what I often see people talking about is kind of Deleuze's defense of science, but to me it's like we have to make sure not to simplify science too much and really see the very kind of like the struggles and the difference within science that is going in all these different directions. And to me, it's like a certain kind of science that he is coming to terms with, and most or much of science he's oppositional to. But I don't know if that's correct.
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's absolutely right. I think if you picked up, if you haven't read it already, a copy of Prigogine and Stenger's Order Out of Chaos, which I think is a book heavily influenced by Deleuze in a lot of ways. And so this is where chaos theory and dynamical systems theory and that sort of stuff came out of in certain respects. So much, and it's Stenger's who's doing all that work, so much of what unfolds in that book is a kind of interrogation of the history of science and certain representational assumptions that it has made both in its understanding of phenomena, but also in terms of the sorts of problems and questions it's been willing to pose at all. And we have to remember in this chapter that when Deleuze is engaging with Kant here, and he's talking about Kant, he talks about these illusions that are immanent to thought, right? There's almost, I wouldn't be using the term tragic in the sense that he uses it. There's almost this tragic dimension to this whole process, that there are sort of ineluctable illusions that we suffer from. They're just unavoidable, that arise at the level of the actual and condition how we pose problems and how we pose questions. And certainly science wouldn't be immune to that either. And so in Kant we have this idea of illusions internal to reason. They're not simple errors, right, where I've failed to incorrectly represent things. Reason itself, my own thought, plunges me into these ways of thinking, and the whole critical project is to diagnose these and simultaneously explain, well, why does reason do this? Kant is still pre-Darwinian, and so he has a teleological, design-oriented concept of nature. He makes this argument explicitly in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals when he says, look, the purpose of reason isn't for getting around the world or finding happiness. Nature would have given us an instinct to do this, and reason even makes us deeply unhappy. It is for the sake of fulfilling our moral duty, is the argument he makes there. It's designed for that purpose. And so for Kant, if we fall prey to these illusions, there must be a teleological reason, a design reason that we fall prey to those. After Darwin, we lose that option of explanation. We can't make that kind of an appeal any longer. I'm not sure where I was going with all of that, but the point here is that Deleuze seems to be developing his own account of illusions internal to reason itself, and science would be no more immune to that than anything else. And so he quotes very favorably Heidegger at a certain point, which is one of these really great moments in Heidegger. Where is he taking this from? This is footnote 18. In chapter 4. Oh, Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics. And he says, by a repetition of a fundamental problem, we understand the disclosure of the primordial possibilities concealed in it. The development of these possibilities has the effect of transforming the problem and thus preserving it in its import as a problem. To preserve a problem means to free and to safeguard its intrinsic powers, which are the source of its essence and which make it possible as a problem. This is on page 201. The repetition of the possibilities of a problem, therefore, is not a simple taking up of that which is in vogue with regard to this problem. The possible, thus understood, in fact, hinders all genuine repetition and thereby all relation to history. A good interpretation must, on the contrary, decide how far understanding of the possible, which governs all repetition, extends and whether it is equal to that which is repeatable. And what's interesting, I mean, he kind of, shows us his cards for a minute here by quoting Heidegger in this way. We might say that there is a scholarly way of approaching philosophical texts which tries to get at, what was it that Spinoza really thought or really meant, and then this sort of way of approaching texts in the way that Deleuze is talking about, repeating them, which in repeating those texts might produce something that is unrecognizable, right? I think Baidu attempts something like this with Plato's Republic, where he translates Plato's Republic, and it's not designed to be an authentic, although it follows it pretty closely in a number of respects. It's not designed to be an authentic and scholarly translation of Plato. It's designed to repeat Plato for us today. And so I guess, what I'm getting at here is when he goes back to these earlier thinkers of the calculus and engages with them, it's not to necessarily preserve them as they were, but to carry out almost a sort of archaeology of the problems that they were dealing with and uncover, I guess, new possibilities of thought.
Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think one of the things he admires about Heidegger is Heidegger's insistence on always re-asking the question of being. And what's interesting when you follow Heidegger's career is his re-asking of this question got him very different concepts of what being is. I mean, early on in Being in Time, you get being as the clearing or the background familiarity that Dreyfus talks about. In the 30s, you end up getting to Ereigness, and somehow it's the giving of this familiarity, the giving of givenness. Later on, he goes all the way to rethinking being as physis, as the productive power of nature, which really doesn't have to do with, Dasein as much, and so he downplays Dasein, constantly re-asking the same question. It's like he was testing out the virtual field that this problem is connected to. And I think this is Heidegger is a good example of this, where, you can get tired, even with my background with Heidegger, at some point you're like, okay, if I have the being question, like how many times are we going to do this? And yet, when you stand back from it, I mean, you have those essays on like, building, dwelling, thinking, and the thing, and you end up somehow he thinks of it in terms of the fourfold. So I guess the interesting takeaway from that is just how repeating the problem, repeating the question, can lead to these variations that can take you into new directions.
Yeah, and I mean, when if you read Heidegger's Sophist lectures, which are absolutely brilliant, I mean, at the scholarly level, they kind of work, but they produce an entirely different Plato and Aristotle in those lectures. I mean, it's just and so, you know, somehow strangely they're true to Aristotle and Plato, yet they produce something very different.
He was known for that. You know, that's what made him famous with a lot of his students early on, is how he would read Aristotle and they'd go, "Oh my God, like it's Aristotle, but it's a repetition with difference, where it's something totally new as well." And you know, that's kind of how he got his reputation early on.
Yeah, and yeah, and so I guess maybe we could, if we wanted to explore that sort of issue, we could talk about different styles of reading. You know, one that reads in terms of the actual, boom, you have this text here, and you're supposed to make sense of what that text is saying, what the arguments of it were, what it would have been, you know, almost like being a constitutional originalist or something. You know, what did the writers of the Constitution really mean? And then there's this virtual style of reading that tries to repeat the problem that somehow animates the text, which is nowhere to be found in the text. It's a, you know, a virtual, it's an idea, it's a multiplicity, it's a virtual field of singularities. And so if we were to rewrite, you know, Lucretius's De Rerum Natura today, you know, certainly we wouldn't be talking about overcoming superstition or religion as he talks about it. It's, you know, we might talk about overcoming ideology, right? That's or consumerism or something like that. If we were, right, you know, some way the coordinates of the problem get transformed in this reactivation of the problem.
And I think that's part of what he's getting at, where, you know, the problem is connected to the idea. And for him, that's, you know, one of the interesting things is these ideas in the virtual themselves vary. They themselves change. And so to repeat the idea in a different time period is going to, you know, the idea itself has undergone a becoming. It's changed in and of itself.
Yeah. I mean, elsewhere he refers to the Borges story of, you know, the guy who is translating, what is it, Don Quixote? And, you know, you read this story and it's identical, right? But nonetheless, you know, the guy who is translating it and says, no, it's entirely different, right? This rewriting of Don Quixote, even though it's all the same words and everything like that, is entirely different. It signifies in an entirely different way, which is this sort of idea.
One thing that this is leading me to want to ask is the question of how we're able to relate to problems or ideas. So like sort of the question of what is the faculty that is able to sort of know them and sort of interact with them and sort of produce solutions to these problems. And like, because he sort of starts out with Kant. He's kind of building this up from Kant's notion of reason, and then but then he says, you know, it's not reason that actually has access to problems, and it's not some special faculty. It's all of the faculties at the transcendent limit of their exercise, right? So that they. But then he turns around and says, well, and yet thought actually has a special place here, because when, like, after the transcendent exercise of the faculties takes place, thought has some sort of consolidating role or something like that. I'm not really sure I totally understand. And then he talks about, like, in one of his kind of more tonal poetic passages, he talks about, like, love and wrath as sort of two moments in the relationship to problems and solutions. And so love is something more like the distillation of the singularities in the problem, or sort of like clarifying the nature of what's going on in the virtual. And then wrath is something like it connects it to the condensation of singularities, like that somehow it's like after the clarification of the singularities, something is condensed and a new sort of actual entity is produced. But it wasn't, it seems almost like the way Heidegger's putting it, those two things happen at the same time, or like that it's all just kind of repetition of difference. But sometimes he kind of posits it as though there are kind of two different very types of moment in relation to problems. So anyway, I'm kind of asking a whole bunch of different things, but just this topic of how we relate to problems.
Yeah, I think those are really good questions. Let's take 10 or 15 minutes and come back with those questions. I think they're excellent questions, and I think that there are different directions that we could go in. And I'm not sure that, at least for me, that the text itself is entirely clear as to which direction we could go in. I mean, the one that's not going to satisfy you, I think, is the romantic answer to your question that we are the patients of our ideas. We're not the agents of our ideas. And so, the very question, how did you put it? How are we doing this? How are we posing the problems? Well, it's not we who are doing it. It's our unconscious. It's the world. But that doesn't fit very easily with what the mathematicians are doing that he was talking about earlier with Galois and so on and so forth. And so let's pick up with that. So I think that's kind of the question, and one of them that we've been circling around, for a number of sessions. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds great.
Yep. Maybe we could begin cycling back in.
Just while we're waiting, I was wondering if this was the article on, he says Dan Smith?
Yeah.
On Deleuze and Deleuze. I think the title is Mathematics and the Theory of Multiplicities.
I believe that is it.
Cool, thank you.
But I could be confusing it with something else.
Hey, Julian, another out of the secondary material I've been reading, this one right here by Henry Summers Hall. It has a good discussion of the calculus. It helped me. I mean, the calculus is just over my head at this point, but he spends a good deal of time discussing the different mathematicians Deleuze utilizes and discusses. So it's worth looking at.
Yeah, I'm trying to, I mean, it might have been, when was Henry's book published?
I think it was last year, actually.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I'm wrong about that. It was 2013.
All right. Because I think there was somebody else who worked with these issues. I can't remember it. It's just a vague sort of memory, and I don't remember getting very much out of it just because it was way over my head, the level at which the person was working.
Yeah, it definitely could be, you know, an entire book to cover this. Summers Hall, he just kind of, you know, spends, I think, 4 or 5 pages on each main section of each chapter. And so, yeah, you know, every commentator has, you know, their good parts. Like your commentary, it's by far the best one on the encounter, and the sentiendum and memorandum. You spent the most on that, and so I think
I'm all wrong now. But
so what?
I think I'm all wrong now, but
well, it helps me right now. Like it's good stuff on the encounter. Because here's the thing: it's interesting how a lot of the commentators, they kind of just skim through the encounter stuff, and you know, I think it is this pivotal point in the book because you know, it gives us this access to pure difference, the differential, and you know, that's you know, this key moment. You know, I still trying to figure out what the transcendental limit of each faculty is. It's difficult to try to picture that because you know, it has to break with picture thinking in some sense. You know, but you know, I think that's a really key part of the book, and you know, I was really happy that you tackled it in such detail.
It's been a long time.
And then you know, James Williams, like I like his commentary. You know, for a long time, his commentary was difficult for me to read. I had trouble following his kind of style of rhetoric, but the more I've read it, the more, you know, there are moments in it where he really does clarify some of the important distinctions. And so, yeah, I mean, all of them have been helpful in their own way.
Hopefully Hunter comes back here in a minute.
I'm going to throw this. This was just one of the main questions, so maybe we can at some point kind of go through this. And it's really, I think, one of the main things in this chapter is really just kind of getting an idea of what the idea is. And then, you know, one of the good things James Williams mentioned is he says that the translation of the chapter title, that Patton actually mistranslated it. It's not the ideas and the synthesis of difference. It's the ideal synthesis of difference. And Williams' thought is that the reason he didn't translate it, you know, in a strict way, is the ideal synthesis of difference tends to, and you know, the American English reader going to go, oh, it's the perfect synthesis of difference. But he also says, you know, kind of mistranslating it the way he did path, because what Deleuze is arguing in this chapter is that ideas are necessary for the synthesis of difference, and the idea that somehow it's the ideas that form these networks of differences. They're not just chaos, you know, there's these structures, and that's what's necessary for the production of actual determinate things, is for differences to get synthesized together.
Mm-hmm. There's Hunter.
Hello.
All right, so where were we? And just full disclosure, I have a brutal headache, so you know, we'll see how long I can go. But
we were talking about, Hunter was asking about how, what is our relation to ideas? In what sense can we think of ourselves standing in relation to the ideas?
So do we have thoughts here?
Well, I'm thinking about like what are we in terms of, for Deleuze, like the subject. Is the subject just an idea as well? Because that was a question that I kept coming to me as I was reading it. Like, what is the self? What is the subject for Deleuze? Is it simply the larval subject sort of thing, or is there something like larger than that, but not like an identity itself? So thinking about, and I kind of came to the conclusion that the subject was an idea, but I'm not super confident in that sort of conclusion.
Other thoughts and in response to Jacob here?
I kind of take the ideas, the self is this kind of synthetic unity of these larval selves that, you know, when he talks about the global ego or the global self, it's this sense that somehow there's a kind of networked unification of these syntheses, and what we experience phenomenologically is, you know, oh, me or I-ness or whatever, is really just the byproduct of these larval selves forming a kind of synthetic network.
Hey, Hunter, what exactly were you asking before the break? Maybe you can resituate us.
Sure. So I guess the basic question, kind of to repeat, is the question of how do we access and relate to ideas? And he asked the question in the chapter, well, do we have a special faculty for it? Mm-hmm. And he begins that he constructs his concept of idea starting with Kant's notion of reason, but he rejects the idea that reason is the faculty with which we access ideas. And then he also rejects the idea proposed by one of the like differential calculus occultists that we have a special faculty for ideas. And then he returns to the theme of the transcendent exercise of all the faculties, which I guess maybe it was in the image of thought when he first sort of brought up that notion. But then so kind of two things from there. One is that then after that he says, so whatever exactly that means, the transcendent exercise of the faculties of every faculty, poetic. You know, his notion of faculty is very broad. So like a social faculty, poetic faculty, mathematical faculty. They approach it as but thought actually has a special privileged place. Even though all the faculties touch ideas at the level of their transcendent exercise, thought sort of comes back in and let's see, I wrote down a quote.
What page is this on?
My book isn't right here, so unfortunately, I know it's in the fifth little subsection, I think towards the beginning. So, yeah, sorry to not have the page number, but I'll just read the quote anyway. The parasense or violence, which is communicated from one faculty to another, assigns a particular place to thought. Thought grasps its own cogitandum only at the extremity of the fuse of violence, which from one idea to another first sets in motion sensibility and its sentiendum. This extremity might well be regarded as the ultimate origin of ideas. And then he goes into this thing of like the difference between a question and a problem, right? And so a question is something like what causes an idea, and a problem is sort of like the differential field of singularities that is sort of like a, the working process of dealing with the question. Then he has all this kind of beautiful stuff about the dice throw and sort of imperatives, and like they're just, he just sort of like, I have another quote: questions are imperatives, or rather questions express the relation between problems and the imperatives from which they proceed. Problems are inseparable from a power of decision, a fiat which, when we are infused with it, makes us semi-divine beings. Which is a pretty intense passage. So anyway, and then last thing I'll say is that then he seems to divide it into two, that there's sort of like adjunction versus condensation, or love versus wrath. Somehow like it's like selecting something from the question to create a problematic field is one thing that we do in relation to ideas, and another thing we do is pass from the problematic
we have to be careful, right? Because we're not sure if we're doing it, right?
Right. Yeah. Sure. Well, yeah. Well, whatever we means, I guess.
Yeah.
But anyway, it seems like there's sort of a way up. There's a way into the virtual and a way out. It seems like he's saying, and that it's like the constitution of a field of singularities is the way in. Start going from question to problem, and then there's a way out, sort of from problem to solution. So anyway, that's kind of my ramblings on this topic. Not one question, but just sort of a general curiosity about what's going on here, and an attempt to kind of give an account of it.
So you're around 190, I think.
There's also the whole thing about vice diction, the two procedures of vice diction, which I wasn't really sure what he was getting at there, but it seems pretty important in relation to learning.
Yeah, it seems
the
important.
quote about the fiat is on 197. I also marked that passage at the bottom, kind of.
And so, I guess one of the initial questions to ask, and he might have, I can't recall right now because it's been a while. He might have answered this in chapter 3, so it's been a while since we looked at it. I mean, the first question would be, is thought a faculty, right? We can make a textual decision here. And so, like your suggestion seems to be that the faculty of thought is being privileged in relation to all of these other faculties, that it has a sort of special place. But the other option that we could take interpretively would be to say that thought takes place in all of the faculties and between the faculties as well. So it's not itself a faculty. And so, elsewhere, there's an article by Deleuze. I think it's in Elizabeth Kaufman's anthology on Deleuze called Having an Idea in Cinema, or What Does It Mean to Have an Idea in Cinema? And, you know, one of his points, and it's a very generous point, I think, with regard to the other practices, is that they all think, and this is something, you know, a point that he'll make again much later in life with What is Philosophy, where you have philosophy, science, and art, and each one of these forms of practice involves thinking. They just think in different ways, and so it's been a long time since I read the essay on Having an Idea in Cinema. But as I recall, the idea seems to be that that the director thinks through images, right? The director creates and invents images, whereas the philosopher thinks through concepts. The scientist thinks through what he calls functions, and you know, we could probably pluralize that to the other faculties. I mean, the issue, you know, how did you put it? Like, how can we access the ideas? The reason that I'm hesitating and I'm going back and forth, because, you know, it seems like if we're gonna, this very provocative idea that he tells us precious little about. Yeah, I know that in Bergsonism, he gives us some examples of false problems and everything like that. But really, there needs to be a much more robust, in my opinion, account of how we distinguish true from false problems. And so methodologically, you know, if we wanted something like a Deleuzian methodology, we want, or I want, something like, okay, so how do we go about posing problems, formulating these ideas, distinguishing between the true and the false problems? And, you know, when he talks about the mathematicians, he even seems to suggest that something like this is possible. But then elsewhere, when he's talking about Marx in particular, you know, he makes that offhand comment from the 18th, this is on page 186, from the contribution to the critique of political economy at the bottom of the note there on Althusser and social ideas. You know, he says, mankind always sets itself only such tasks as it can solve. It does not mean that the problems are only apparent or that they are already solved, but on the contrary, that the economic conditions of a problem determine or give rise to the manner in which it finds a solution within the framework of the real relations of the society. Not that the observer can draw the least optimism from this. For these solutions may involve stupidity or cruelty, the horror of of war, or the solution of the Jewish problem, which he has in quotation marks. More precisely, the solution is always that which a society deserves or gives rise to as a consequence of the manner in which, given its real relations, it is able to pose a problem set within it and to try and to it by the differential relations it incarnates. And so this is timely for us, of course, with everything that's happening right now. But you know, maybe I'm reading it too strongly, but there it sounds like there's almost a determinism of the idea in society, a certain sort of ineluctability about the idea that just can intrinsically give rise to these stupid and cruel solutions.
You know, one of the I think one of the important passages to help give us an idea of what's going on and, you know, how do we relate to ideas is on the top of 198. And he discusses his distinction again between learning and knowledge. But in this discussion here, he talks about, he uses the example of the swimmer, but he also gives the example of learning a foreign language. And for him, somehow relating to the virtual or relating to the idea seems to have two main ways for him, which is our bodies relate to it and language relates to it for us. Kind of seems to connect to the distinction he and Guattari make between machinic assemblages of bodies and assemblages of enunciation. But he says, learning to swim or learning a foreign language means composing the singular points of one's own body or one's own language with those of another shape or element, which tears us apart, but also
198.
192.
Oh, 192.
It tears us apart, but also propels us into a hitherto unknown and unheard of world of problems. So I think this is a moment where we get a kind of simplistic, and I mean that in a good way, example. Tapping into the ideas is trying to do something new with your body, or trying to say something new, think something new you haven't thought before. And so, he goes on to, what are we dedicated, if not to those problems which demand the very transformation of our body and of our language? So somehow, it's when our bodies can't do something, or when we can't say or think something. Again, it's kind of Heideggerian, where there's this breakdown moment, something doesn't go right, or you can't just skillfully cope with the world. You need to change. You got to acquire an ability through testing what your body can do, positioning your body in new ways, that you acquire this new ability on the actual level of reality. But it's through, and again, it's like, his swimmer example. What's a swimmer do? Well, you're learning to test the pressures, the intensities in this new field of water. And so, he talks about it in terms of signs, and that term's always been tricky to me in Deleuze, but I think I'm starting to understand it, where what the sign is that somehow you're getting it right. I mean, all of the physical aspects of swimming are not going to be something you learn, but learning how to move correctly is those motions and those configurations of the body at certain points in that environment are signs of all of these physical mechanisms that you don't actually perceive or don't really understand, and yet you learn to manipulate them and to gain the ability to function in that environment. And it's through, again, experimenting with the virtual.
So what are going to be the singular points here to work with Deleuze? So, first off, we're told that with the ideas or the problems or the multiplicities, we're told that they don't resemble the solution, right? So they can't be modeled on the end result there. And so if we're talking about the case of swimming, which he gives us a few examples. It's a theme he returns to throughout the book. It's there in the introduction. I can't remember if it's in chapter 1 or chapter 2. It comes back here again in this example. What are going to be the singular points?
I think it has to do, and I think this is Spinoza's in some sense, where gaining an affect it involves reconfiguring the body in different ways, and so gaining the ability to ride a bike, you're basically learning how to configure your knees, your feet, your hands, your back. If one of those, I guess we could say, one of those points is off in this configuration, then you're not going to have balance, or you're going to fall. And so it's this, coordinate system, so to speak, comprised of these points. I know I feel like I don't have the language to do this justice, but it's, the points in the configuration that allow you to gain access to gain the ability. And, it's a matter of pressure. It's a matter of how much intensity the legs have when they pedal. Again, like the basketball example, if you put too much pressure on the ball, then you can't control it. You put too little, you can't control it. So it's all of these kind of, for lack of a better word, learning like wave pressure or something that allow you to gain these physical abilities.
Yeah, and so I think that there are going to be two fields of singularities there. If we stick to the example of swimming, there are going to be the singularities of the water, and there are going to be the singularities of the body. And what exactly these might be, that's a more difficult question to answer, I think. Right, but these, it's not just the body alone. These form an idea of multiplicity together. It's the body plus water, not just the body, I would think.
You go back to the calculus, right? Like that's what calculus does, is it gives you that point.
That's what?
What the calculus does is it gives you those points, in the curve or the function. And I think that's it's something that's going on here. Again, if you use too much force, then you can either, mess up what you're trying to do or what you're trying to learn, use too little. And so somehow it's like that, the curve of the function in a differential equation. It's finding that right point on that line of change or becoming that allows you to achieve what you're trying to.
And so there's an integration, right? And so we can take very seriously, there's an integration of these two things, the water and the body. I think it's even a little bit nicer to use the example of the ocean rather than the swimming pool. These are different differential fields in each case, and so they're going to be different types of problems. I don't know for swimmers how significant that difference is or not, but Aristotle, of course, has the whole distinction between representational knowledge versus know-how. It's what animates the Nicomachean Ethics, and one of the things that always amuses me in light of Christian conservative perspectives on teaching morality. He says, there's no point in teaching ethics to the young, right? Because they're dominated by their passions and their appetites, and they just don't have enough experience yet in order to be able to benefit from this. And so it's not until later on in life, I guess, when those passions have died down a little bit and somebody has experienced a variety of things, that we are able to learn ethics according to Aristotle. But part of his major claims is that ethics can't be transmitted by speech. You have to do it. And Deleuze seems to be very much in this camp with respect to learning, right? He says early on in that example, I want to say it's in the introduction, he says the swimming instructor that lays down on the sand and makes motions is a bad teacher, that the student has to actually jump into the water. The good teacher is somebody who says, do with me, not do as I do, because you have to discover those singularities through your own engagement. And so, of course, everybody's body is different, and it's going to enter into different differential relations with that field.
That's exactly how I interpret what he's saying here. Again, you could have Michael Jordan standing there and he could tell you everything he can tell you about basketball. You still won't be able to play basketball if you haven't undergone the learning process yourself of doing it. And this is why I think he emphasizes this difference between learning and knowledge, where learning, it doesn't have to do with representation. It doesn't have to do with recognition. It has to do with trial and error.
Yeah, and so there's a synthesis going on here, right? Of these singularities, they're brought together into relations with one another that can then gradually resolve themselves or integrate themselves into an actuality of some sort or another. Now, on this issue of false problems, which I think goes to maybe some of the issues that Hunter is getting at. One of the points that he repeats again and again is that false problems emerge from confusing distinctive points or singular points with ordinary points. And then the other possible way we can go wrong is, which is surprising once you go on and read the logic of sense, just nonsensical problems. And so, the question here is, how exactly do we parse that? He's working at such a high level of abstraction that it's difficult to bring back that very abstract vocabulary of ordinary and singular points to swimming or learning a language.
I feel like I sort of get it in terms of, like, say in playing basketball, like there's there's so much you do on the court, the basketball players do on the court, that like isn't necessarily being good at basketball. And like, there's certain like ways of jumping around, or like maybe focusing on like the way your uniform looks or something like that, or like where then you fail to excel at basketball because like the effort you're putting into playing, you've failed to see the singular point, or which has to do with like leaping up in a certain way and shooting a 3-pointer. And
I think you're definitely on the right track there, right? I mean, all of us can pretty much learn to dribble a basketball and take a shot. We can't play like Michael Jordan. And so you could say that the difference is that somehow he has, maybe, you can say part of it is just his natural attributes, his height, but somehow he has connected to those singular points that make him excel at basketball, where he's refined he's refined his connection to this virtual field in such a way that the rest of us haven't. And that's precisely why he can manipulate it and excel at it in a way we can't.
I kind of feel like the identification of true and false problems is problematic, in the sense that I think we don't have to use Lacanian language, certainly not, but when like Lacan circumscribes these orders, the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, and then looks at the way that this real appears in all 3 orders, that to me it's problems, differentiated kinds of problems, so they can appear in different orders or registers, rather than true problems or false problems. But what could be a problem in one order or one level, you see what I mean? Like there can they can be differentiated in some sense. It's not about truth or falsity, but it's, I guess, coordinated in relation to the real, which I don't know what Deleuze has a different discursive apparatus, obviously, where the virtual seems to occupy that place, and therefore is very different, because for Lacan the real is the place of the impossible, whereas precisely what we're talking about with the virtual here is something to do with maybe there is no place that holds the place of the impossible in Deleuze's conceptual apparatus. So like, it's for me in the discursive coordinates I'm used to, the problem is always correlated to the real, and the real is always correlated to the impossible. So you can answer these questions in a way. I know it's not an answer to what we're tangling with. What is it for Deleuze that would make a true and false problem? But for me, truth and false is already of a different order. So I can say there are problems of truth and falsity, but they are not problems of the real. They're problems precisely of truth and falsity, which is situated against different coordinates.
Well, I mean, I think in Deleuze it's so difficult to parse because he really takes a hard line against tracing problems from their solutions, right? You know, he's just so careful to you know, distinguish these things that it makes it difficult for me at least to parse what's going on. How do we even think about it? Yeah, I mean, thinking about it in reference to a solution. Do you see what I'm saying there?
But I mean, isn't for Deleuze, not to say solution, but a concept in of itself it simultaneously circumscribes a problem. It's not, you know, a concept appears as a way to think a problem, but it also circumscribes a problem. That's in some way what a concept maybe does.
Is there a difference between a concept and a solution, though? Are concepts closer to ideas than solutions?
I would think so. Yeah,
concepts are closer to ideas.
Because like problems are ideas, but so are solutions. So I'm wondering if concepts.
Well, no, solutions aren't ideas in Deleuze. They're effects. They're what are generated out of these things. Okay. And so, you know, I'm sorry. You know, in trying to, I think of an analysand that I once had, and you know, I've bored people by talking about this, right? But you know, I once had when I was practicing an analysand that had a phobia of weasels, right? And she went to the cognitive behavioral psychologist first, and they thought her problem was weasels. And then you go through all the, you know, the hoops of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? You know, first talking about all the ways in which weasels are great, and then showing them pictures of weasels, and then finally you end up at the petting zoo, and voila, you're cured. And of course, in her case, this was a worsening of the symptom. But I mean, this would be a nice example, I think, of tracing a problem from the solution. You're just the phobia, as psychoanalysis teaches us, is a solution, just like any symptom. It's a solution, but it is a, you know, veiled, disguised, or displaced solution to the problem. The problem has no resemblance to the symptomatic form that it takes, and in her case, it had to do with a really nasty divorce around puberty between her parents that the phobia was dealing with, and you know, it's something. So I don't see how that fits the model of ordinary versus singular points in this case, and in the constitution of that. You know, if we go back to the Jewish solution that Deleuze gives a little bit earlier, it's something similar, right? You know, they treat this this group as the problem that accounts for the antagonisms and the conflicts in society, and they get a very bad solution to those to that problem as well, because they haven't. And so we might not use the terms true and false. We might say poorly posed and well posed when talking about problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think like Deleuze at some point in this chapter talks about, not in the citation we already talked about with Marx, but in another place he talks about commodity fetishism. And for me, you know, Marx's genius is the circumscription of the problem of the commodity and its division between use and abstract value. And he doesn't make a solution precisely. Like capital, which was never finished, is just one big fucking problem. You know, like I think it links back into where we started today, where we were talking about the materialist interpretations of Deleuze versus the idealist interpretations of Deleuze. It's like Deleuze's genius in some sense would be that the concepts that he names allow us to think the problems, and that, you know, that gives a lot of leeway. I mean, we can't just make recourse to his authority to solve the problems. We can only use his concepts to think them, and then, you know, according to another referent, we can make solutions of them. But I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I'm just thinking. It's just, how can we pose problems well? You know, how do we end up? I think building a wall across the border is a dumb solution.
Well, that goes back to what I was just saying with Marx. I mean, right? Like, this is the thing. People build walls because the problem is, in my circumscription as a Marxist of a kind, I mean, commodity form. And instead we, you know, there's the Jewish problem, there's migrants, there's refugees, there's all this, when like the true force of these displacements and things would be, you know, capital, which is constituted through like the commodity form. So, I mean, the thing is that one problem we could say is the production of certain kinds of solutions that, you know, through a certain kind of impotence, you know, we need to posit certain solutions, whereas real problems are precisely problems, and we can circulate them better and worse. But you know,
yeah, I mean, and I'm just trying to use Deleuze's categories here, right? You know, is something like building a wall, would that be an example of tracing the transcendental from the empirical, tracing the problem from the solution? And so, you know, immigrants, you know, jumping the border and everything like that, that's a solution to a problem. And we say, oh, look, you know, there are all these immigrants here. That must be what the problem is. But the problem is really something quite different. It's not the immigrants. They're an effect of this problematic field. Do you see what I'm saying? And so the question is, like, how do you pose the problem well in a way that doesn't trace back to, that doesn't, you know, do that doubling of the propositions of consciousness or something like that, where you get a stupid solution like building a wall? No, right? Them jumping your border isn't your problem.
Two things.
And I, you know, I don't want to, you know, jump into Marxist talk, even though I think that's what's true in this case. It's like, you know, the immigrants jumping the border and everything, that's not the problem. That's an effect of something else. It doesn't resemble at all immigrants jumping a border. It's a, you know, it's a response to
corn,
capitalism, right? Created a set of circumstances where people need to do this in order to be able to live, and you know, a certain form of society where, yeah.
Two things. One, I think the thing he would appeal to kind of help give us a criterion to distinguish between true and false problems is sense. I think, you know, is sense.
Yeah.
You know, he connects sense very, very much to the problem in chapter 3, and they're deeply related. And I think it's because for him, you know, when you go through and you talk about the proposition, all of the aspects of the proposition, designation, signification, manifestation. So manifestation is, it reveals something about me. I believe X is Y. Designation has to do specifically with this this proposition and how it relates to a state of affairs, and then signification has to do with mental content or concepts, ideas, what the proposition signifies. But sense is unique because it's this hinge between meaning and actual states of affairs. And it's, you know, I kind of prefer the term context here, but when you think about it, context is somehow a social thing, and yet it also is connected to the actual state of affairs in the world. And so somehow I think you would say refining, getting better attuned to the context, you know, getting a greater attunement to it, how we could distinguish between true problems and false problems. And I mean, that's what you guys just did. Like when you go into like the Marxist analysis, it's getting a much expanded context of social dynamics, political problems. It's not zeroing in on some little empirical content, people jumping the border. It's expanding the context into a much larger frame of reference. And so yeah, I think sense has a key role to play in that.
But like, I guess to go back to the true false problems, to me, it's like at the level of truth and falsity, jumping the wall is a true and false problem. Just like swimming or basketball playing, this is why the real is an important category to my thinking, because if you're presented with a wall, of course, the truth and falsity of the negotiation of that problem matter immensely. What I mean is, like, there's a, in the same way we're talking about how you learn to play basketball or swim, you can also learn to jump a wall, and it can be a true problem according to.
But I mean, that's a different problem. So like what I was saying is the wall is proposed as a solution to a problem. The problem
No, totally.
As the immigrants.
But this is why I mean the orders, in a sense that there to me there should be, Deleuze's system should account for this difference in problems, different problems, or differentiation of problems, rather than true false. Well posed does help with this, because we can pose the problem of facing concrete obstacles and getting over them well or not well, or abstract ones for that matter, right? Because like if we're talking about the wall and people coming over them, we can think about, the prices of corn, NAFTA, the global system of capitalism, all the way to the point of like going over to that wall, like, crossing that wall, and the kind of know-how.
Is this a problem for him though? Pardon the, but I mean, would he not be able to respond to what you're saying there?
Of course he would, but
yeah. Because I agree. It's a true problem. How do I get over the wall? And they're going to find solutions. They will. I know that they. It's that won't be a problem.
Another difficulty in this lies in he associates the problems with ideas. The ideas are virtual, and in that sense, it's like we've discussed before, where poverty is not this thing that you can point at concretely and say, oh, there's the problem. Poverty is this, in a sense, this invisible network, right? One of the questions I would ask, though, is, aren't there actual problems? I mean, even though he always emphasizes their relation to the ideas and the virtual, I mean, it's kind of a silly example, but if you're out camping in the woods and you're confronted by a bear, I mean, that's not really a problem. I mean, I guess you could say it's a problem with how to respond to it, and that's the virtual, but you could say that the problem's the actual bear in some sense.
But if we're talking about non-localizable differential relations, it can't be the bear. Right? It's that entire context or field, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what, I mean, we keep, all of us do, right? This is what I meant by, illusions immanent to thought itself, right? We want to fixate on the thing or one element, right? And so you were like right there when you're talking about learning to ride a bike, but you didn't talk about the bike. You just talked about the body on the bike, right? And the differential field is the planet Earth and the bike and that particular person's body and, all those sorts of things. It doesn't resemble the solutions, moving your legs in a particular way or something like that. That's the integration, the actualization in species and parts, I guess, and spatiotemporal dynamisms that finally precipitate the solution.
Yeah, I guess like it's we're going around to all these different kinds of problems, and so one thing worth mentioning, right, is that Deleuze is very interested in having this be a universal sort of ontology and ethics in the same stroke, where so this answers the question of how species evolve, as well as how like you deal with immediate practical issues, as well as the kinds of things that we were talking about, which I think this is most appropriate to, like that I think he's really thinking of the most, which is like things like learning a new skill, or having a body of work and being an artist and creating new artworks. Like that's what really applies the best, it seems to me. And then,
well, I don't think it necessarily applies there the best. I think it's all over the place.
Well, I mean, what I was gonna say is that then, and then when we start talking about the political problems, like it does seem like it's hard. Like when we're talking, so like with the wall and Marx, like who gets to say that that by understanding Marx, the field better, like because it could. There's different, some people don't believe that Marx was right. Like you could say, well, we'll know the field better by understanding like Hayek or some like neoliberal, view or something like that. And so like it's just like he's making this the whole sort of project of this kind of like univocity. Philosophy of univocity is this like speculative leap where every kind of problem is essentially the same kind of thing, whether it's politics or whether it's art or whether it's ordinary practical engagement or whether it's life itself. And it's interesting to kind of tease out the different versions of problem that it's supposed to apply to and see how well it applies to each. Because I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think he's right that there's a univocity of the problem. I'm not really sure what.
I think they're going to take a variety of different forms and at different scales, and so we get, as so often happens in philosophy, we get a general theory of the problem, and then for each domain, just like he specifies, the problems have to be specified, and there's a creative element in there as well. I always find it helpful personally to try and go with the simple examples, and in particular the non-political examples. I think we just want to jump into politics so quickly and have answers there that we don't necessarily get things straight. And so I think of a student that I have right now, for example, and she's just trying so hard, and she's a very smart woman, but she's really struggling with this class. And when I look at her book, she has underlined every sentence in the reading. And then over top of those underlining, she has taken highlighters in different colors and highlighted almost every passage. And then over top of that, she's annotated all of the margins. And this is the issue for her. She hasn't yet been able to find the singularities of the text that we're reading. And so that would be an example of confusing distinctive and ordinary points. And it's very difficult to articulate to a student in the classroom to tell them how to distinguish between what is ordinary, right, the shaft, versus what is singular in the text, which is what they need to be able to get at. It's something that we struggle with, throughout the course of our training and everything, how to draw those sorts of distinctions. What constitutes the geometry of the text or the topology of the text as singular points that articulate its that articulate its internal logic. And so, I think like a simple example like that, her thought and her background is entering into a set of differential relations with whatever texts we happen to read. And there's this process that the student goes through in learning that material that doesn't consist in simply being able to quote, Epictetus on this page or that page or that page. The student hasn't understood the material yet. The student has understood the material, I would say, when they reach that point of being able to think in that universe or articulate that logic, not anything that the philosopher necessarily explicitly said, right, but to work according to that logic. And it's really only through that repeated engagement and experimentation with that text that skill, I hate to talk about skills, begins to develop and emerge. And it's not something that's easily transmitted. in the speech of the professor or the instructor. There's no set of rules that I could give. I can give general guidelines like, when Kant says something like, there's only one thing that's truly good, a goodwill, well, you immediately need to ask yourself, well, what is a goodwill, right? And then you need to go in and locate these things. And then the examples help to illustrate that point. But you have to, as a friend of mine, many years used to say, who was very much a Deleuzian, you have to grok with it to find the singularities.
Just as like a supplement, one thing, I think he would maybe say that there are varieties of problems besides the
he does say it.
Yeah, the true false, because there's varieties of ideas. On 187, he lists, he says, ideas are varieties which include in themselves sub-varieties. We can distinguish 3 dimensions of variety. And he goes on to discuss them. The first is the ordinal, the second is the characteristic, and the third is the axiomatic. So maybe we could say there's ordinal problems, characteristic problems, and axiomatic problems as well.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah. And that would be interesting to develop and see, what exactly that means. Because I had taken the varieties. There are physical varieties, biological varieties, social varieties, artistic varieties, cognitive varieties, and everything like that. And then we could probably even, well, not even probably, we could then further specify. We can have as many varieties, I think, as we might like.
Yeah.
So there is the idea of life in general, which isn't a mental, if I'm understanding him correctly, if we can, apply him this way, there's the idea of life in general, what he calls the animal with the capital A, which doesn't eat anything, it doesn't photosynthesize, it doesn't move around. It's just this multiplicity that is the virtuality of all life. And then, right, that gets further specified down, I would imagine, into different types that can then solve the environment in different ways, plants and reptiles and fish and so on and so forth. Or the phylum.
That reminds me, I remember having the thought that maybe what he means when he talks about privileging thought is that thought is what is uniquely able to transfer a singularity from one variety to another. So like to take like a concept from hydrodynamics and transpose it into theory of the mind, but then you kind of expand that, or like to be a painter but be inspired by a musical problem, that's the third thing he was talking about, like how a singularity sort of leaps from like one realm to another. And there was some reason I had for thinking that maybe that's why he distinguished thought as a unique faculty, in spite of the fact that all of the other faculties are able to touch ideas.
I mean, maybe I had thought of thought as the throw of the dice, bringing the singularities in relation to one another, and then the gradual working out of that field of singularities in the process of actualization.
So thought is just the actualizing process for any.
Well, I mean, part of it would be how the singularities are brought together as well, or the integrative process of these singularities in their reciprocal determination.
Yeah, maybe that's.
Yeah, doesn't he call that perplication? Is his term? Let's see, I think
Yeah, I remember him using that term.
Yeah, it's on the page with the 3 varieties. On 187, he says, We propose the term perplication to designate this distinctive and coexistent state of the ideas.
But is that the same thing? I mean, the suggestion there is that all the ideas coexist and glimmer with each other around their edges.
Mm-hmm.
And so that seems to be...
Yeah, that would be a little different.
Oh, wait, hold on. I think what I'm thinking...
I mean, that could be right, you know, a synthesis of ideas.
This isn't quite what I was looking for, but on a note that's related to all this, I was very interested in this sort of passage on 198, the kind of long tonal passage about chance and the dice throw. And he has this, he repeats in a number of different ways the basic idea that affirmation, or this imperative to affirm the whole of chance every time in a single time. And he seems really like sort of excited about this idea that that in a way the way that you affirm the eternal return, or like the way that you like do the right thing, is by affirming the whole of chance every time in a single time. And it says, this affirmation takes place to the degree that the disparates which emanate from a throw begin to resonate, thereby forming a problem, which is, I guess, yeah, that's just, so that's like what thought is, kind of, or something. But yeah, I'm not sure why he's talking about it in terms of affirming the whole of chance every time in a single time, or if that's just another way of sort of poetically saying affirm the eternal return.
What else can you do? I mean, I think this is his, you know, version of thrownness. This is the world you're thrown into. You know, Kafka didn't choose to be a Jew in Prague, and so, you know, chances being thrown into those circumstances, the dots that come up on the dice are those linguistic circumstances. If we go with Kafka towards a minor literature of Yiddish and Hebrew and German, and the affirmation of chance is the synthesis of those singularities and the production of that literature, making German speak Yiddish, I think is the way Deleuze and Guattari describe it in that book, which isn't the affirmation of a Jewish identity. It's the, you know, just like Michael Phelps entered into a becoming dolphin, he synthesized his body with the movement of a dolphin in relation to the water, brilliantly so, producing a new type of swimming. Right, this produces something other than being German or being Jewish. All right, guys, my mind is broken. This is all I can take for this evening.
Thanks, everybody. Great talk.
All right. Thank you.
All right, John, so you are leading us next week with the asymmetrical synthesis of the sensible?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. So we can pick up here next week.
All right, so long, everyone.
Yeah.
Good discussion.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Sorry to cut us 5 minutes short, but I'm going to float away, so.
All right, no problem.
Okay. See you later.
You have plenty. Thank you. Bye.